The brass elevator doors reflected Nina Castellano's tired face as she pressed the button marked PH, her cleaning cart rattling with supplies that smelled of lemon and bleach. 23 floors separated the lobby from the penthouse that nobody dared enter without explicit permission, a vertical distance that felt more like crossing into another country than simply moving through a building. Her daughter sat on the cart's lower shelf, legs dangling, a worn sketch pad clutched against her small chest like armor. Sofia was 7 years old with eyes that watched everything and said nothing, her silence not from shyness but from understanding that came too early. The girl had learned to make herself invisible in spaces where children weren't supposed to exist, a skill Nina wished she'd never needed to develop. But single mothers working night shifts as cleaning staff didn't have the luxury of proper childcare, and the group home's after-hours program had closed 3 months ago due to budget cuts that nobody with power seemed to notice or care about. The elevator climbed with mechanical precision, while Nina's heart rate increased with each passing floor. She'd been cleaning Castellano Tower for 6 months, working her way up from the lower offices to the executive suites, earning trust through competence and discretion that her supervisor valued enough to finally assign her the penthouse rotation. The pay increase would mean actual groceries instead of food bank donations, maybe even catching up on the electric bill that threatened disconnection every other month. But the penthouse belonged to Dante Moretti, and everyone who worked in this building knew exactly what that meant. His name appeared on the lobby directory as CEO of Moretti Holdings, a legitimate real estate development company that generated enough profit to justify the private helicopter pad on the roof. What the directory didn't mention was the empire underneath that facade, the network of influence and control that made politicians nervous and competitors disappear into early retirement or unmarked graves depending on how much they challenged his authority. Nina had seen him exactly once, 3 weeks ago when she'd been cleaning the 20th floor executive conference room after midnight. He'd arrived unexpectedly with 2 men whose suits couldn't quite hide the bulges of shoulder holsters, their conversation stopping the moment they'd noticed her presence. Dante's eyes had tracked her movement across the room with the focused attention of someone cataloging potential threats, his expression neutral, but his stillness somehow more frightening than obvious aggression would have been. She'd finished her work in half the usual time, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed her cart toward the elevator, feeling his gaze follow her until the doors had closed. Her supervisor had called the next morning to inform her that Mr. Moretti had specifically requested she be assigned to his penthouse cleaning rotation, a request that sounded like opportunity but felt like the kind of attention that could ruin lives if you made a single mistake. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the 23rd floor, the doors sliding open to reveal a private vestibule with marble floors and a single door that required both keycard and biometric scanned access. Nina's supervisor had provided detailed instructions about the security protocol, emphasizing with unusual intensity that she should never, ever deviate from the approved cleaning schedule or enter rooms that remained locked. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Sofia climbed down from the cart with practiced silence, her sneakers making no sound against the polished floor. She positioned herself near the wall where she could see but wouldn't be in the way, her sketch pad opening automatically to a fresh page. Nina had tried to break her daughter of this constant drawing habit, worried it made her seem strange or antisocial to adults who might judge a child for being too quiet, too watchful, too absorbed in capturing the world through charcoal and pencil. But Sofia's art teacher at the underfunded public school had pulled Nina aside 2 months ago to explain that the girl's talent transcended typical childhood creativity. She processed spatial relationships and human expressions with sophistication that suggested either natural genius or trauma-developed hyper-awareness, probably both given their circumstances. The teacher had recommended programs for gifted students, opportunities that required application fees Nina couldn't afford and time commitments that conflicted with her work schedule. So Sofia drew in the margins of their life, filling notebooks with observations that Nina sometimes found uncomfortable in their accuracy. The girl captured people's hidden emotions through the set of shoulders or the angle of a jaw, revealing truths that polite society pretended not to notice. Nina had learned to recognize when Sofia's drawings showed someone dangerous versus simply unhappy, a skill that had helped them avoid problems in their rough neighborhood more than once. The penthouse door required Nina's keycard and thumbprint, the security system beeping twice before the heavy lock disengaged with an audible click. She pushed the door open slowly, professional caution mixing with the kind of fear that came from entering spaces where power lived in its most concentrated form. The interior revealed itself gradually as motion sensor lights activated in sequence, illuminating a space that looked more like a museum than a home. The main living area stretched for what seemed like impossible distance, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of a city that glittered like scattered diamonds against the night sky. The furniture was minimal but clearly expensive, each piece positioned with geometric precision that suggested either professional design or obsessive personality. Original artwork hung on walls painted in shades of charcoal and cream, the paintings abstract enough that Nina couldn't determine if they were supposed to represent anything specific or simply existed as expensive decoration. Sofia stepped inside behind her mother, her eyes already scanning the space with that intense focus that meant she was cataloging details for later rendering. Nina wanted to tell her to stop looking so hard, to just be a normal kid who played on her phone or complained about being bored instead of absorbing everything like she was gathering evidence for some future testimony. But Sofia had never been normal, and pretending otherwise wouldn't change the fundamental nature of how her mind worked. The cleaning checklist Nina's supervisor had provided was 3 pages long, detailing every surface that required attention and specifying products to use on different materials. The penthouse contained 6,000 square feet of space divided into living area, dining room, private office, master suite, 2 guest bedrooms, and a library that apparently held first editions worth more than Nina would earn in her entire lifetime. She had 4 hours to complete the work, the schedule designed to ensure she'd be finished and gone before 6 a.m., when Mr. Moretti typically returned from whatever business kept him occupied through the night. Nina started in the kitchen, a chef's paradise with commercial-grade appliances that looked barely used. The refrigerator contained mostly takeout containers and bottled water, evidence of someone who owned a gourmet kitchen but rarely cooked. She worked methodically, wiping down granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that showed few fingerprints, the pristine condition suggesting either frequent professional cleaning or an owner who rarely touched anything. Sofia had settled near the living room windows, her small form silhouetted against the city lights as her pencil moved across paper with quick, confident strokes. Nina glanced over periodically, torn between wanting to check on her daughter and knowing that Sofia was safest when left alone to do what came naturally. The girl's art had become her way of processing a world that often felt overwhelming, translating observation into something controllable and permanent. The penthouse office door stood slightly ajar, dim light spilling into the hallway from within. Nina's instructions had been explicit about this room: clean only the areas Mr. Moretti specifically unlocked, never touch the desk or filing cabinets, never turn on the computer monitors that lined one wall like mission control for some covert operation. She pushed the door fully open, her hand finding the light switch that illuminated a space organized with military precision. The desk was clear except for a single leather portfolio and a fountain pen that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with codes that meant nothing to Nina but presumably made sense within whatever system Mr. Moretti used to organize his empire. The computer monitors remained dark, their screens reflecting her nervous face as she approached with cleaning supplies. Sofia appeared in the doorway, her sketch pad tucked under one arm, her expression showing that serious concentration that meant she'd noticed something worth capturing. Nina started to tell her to go back to the living room, keep herself occupied and out of the way, but the words died as she saw what her daughter was staring at with such focused intensity. The wall behind the desk held a massive map of the city, pins and strings creating a web of connections that looked like something from a crime investigation television show. Different colored pins marked locations throughout the metropolitan area, red ones clustered in the warehouse district, blue ones scattered through the financial center, green ones in residential neighborhoods that Nina recognized as expensive rather than dangerous. The strings connected pins in patterns that suggested relationships or hierarchies, though their exact meaning remained opaque without context she didn't have and definitely shouldn't seek. Sofia's pencil was already moving, her hand sketching the map's general layout with quick strokes that captured the essential structure without copying it exactly. Nina felt panic rising in her throat. The certain knowledge that this was exactly the kind of thing her supervisor had warned against noticing, let alone documenting through a 7-year-old's frighteningly accurate artistic rendering. She crossed the room quickly, her hand reaching for Sofia's sketch pad with more force than she'd intended. The girl looked up with confusion rather than fear, not understanding why her mother was suddenly treating her normal observation as dangerous instead of impressive. Nina's voice came out harsher than she meant, whispering urgently that they couldn't draw things in Mr. Moretti's office, couldn't create any evidence that they'd paid attention to details meant to remain private. Sofia's expression shifted from confusion to that careful blankness she wore when adults were being irrational, but she'd learned not to argue. She flipped to a fresh page in her sketchpad, the half-completed map of criminal connections hidden beneath drawings of buildings and street scenes that looked innocent enough. Nina returned the pad with shaking hands, her fear making her clumsy as she tried to explain without actually explaining why some things were too dangerous to notice even when they were right in front of you. The cleaning took longer than it should have because Nina kept stopping to make sure Sofia wasn't drawing anything else that could get them killed. Her daughter sat quietly in the living room, sketching the city skyline through the windows, her art now carefully neutral and architectural rather than revealing. But Nina couldn't shake the image of that map, the web of connections that represented power and violence organized with the kind of precision that made it more frightening rather than less. She finished the office and moved to the master suite, a bedroom that felt more like a luxury hotel than someone's private space. The bed was made with hospital corners, the closet organized by color and garment type, the bathroom containing expensive products arranged with the same geometric precision as everything else in the penthouse. Nina worked quickly here, uncomfortable with the intimacy of cleaning someone's private spaces, handling their belongings, and seeing the small details that revealed how they lived when nobody was watching. The attached bathroom was marble and chrome, a spa-like space with a rainfall shower and a soaking tub that looked barely used. Nina cleaned the mirrors and fixtures, restocked the towels, and replaced the soap, her movements automatic from months of similar work in dozens of similar spaces. Rich people's bathrooms all looked basically the same once you stripped away the specific brand names, expensive materials attempting to disguise the fundamental banality of human hygiene routines. She was reaching for the shower door when she noticed it, a small splash of something dark on the tile near the drain. Nina's professional experience told her immediately this was blood. Not much, but enough to require special cleaning procedures she'd been trained on. Her supervisor's instructions had included a specific protocol for finding anything concerning, photograph it, report it immediately, and never mention it to anyone else. But Nina's survival instinct told her that photographing evidence of violence in a mafia boss's bathroom was the kind of choice that got people disappeared along with the evidence. She grabbed paper towels and the hydrogen peroxide solution, scrubbing at the towel with focused intensity until the bloodstain vanished completely. Her hands shook as she threw the stained towels into her trash bag, her mind carefully not considering whose blood that might have been or how it got there. Sofia had wandered into the hallway outside the master suite, her curiosity apparently stronger than her learned caution about staying where she'd been told. She stood near a small table that held a single photograph in a silver frame, the only personal item Nina had seen anywhere in the Penthouse's carefully curated impersonality. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and a smile that looked genuine rather than posed, her arms wrapped around a boy who might have been 10 or 11 years old. Nina recognized the woman's eyes even though decades and hard living separated the person in that photo from the man who now owned the space. Dante Moretti's mother, she assumed, and probably his younger self in that moment before whatever had happened to transform a regular kid into someone powerful and dangerous enough that his home required biometric security and his bathroom occasionally contained evidence of violence. Sofia was sketching again, her pencil capturing the photo's composition with quick strokes. Nina started to tell her to stop, to put away the sketch pad, and just let them finish this job without creating any more documentation of things they shouldn't notice. But something in the careful way Sofia rendered the woman's smile stopped her objection, the girl somehow capturing warmth and sadness in equal measure through simple charcoal shading. The rest of the cleaning passed without incident, Nina moving through the remaining spaces with mechanical efficiency, while Sofia occupied herself with drawings that stayed safely generic. The library held thousands of books organized by subject and author, the collection suggesting either genuine intellectual curiosity or the kind of comprehensive self-education that came from not trusting formal institutions. Nina dusted shelves carefully, noting titles that ranged from classic literature to advanced economics to military strategy, an eclectic combination that painted a picture of someone who consumed information as systematically as he seemed to organize everything else in his life. By 4:30 a.m., Nina had finished the cleaning checklist, her cart repacked with supplies and trash bags full of the minimal debris that accumulated in spaces where people lived but barely left traces. Sofia had filled another 6 pages in her sketch pad, her drawings now showing the penthouse's interior architecture with the kind of detail that made Nina simultaneously proud of her daughter's talent and terrified of what that talent might reveal to anyone who looked too closely. They were moving toward the elevator when Nina noticed the private office door had swung fully closed, the kind of heavy door that required deliberate force to move. She was certain she'd left it slightly ajar like she'd found it, maintaining the exact position of everything she touched. But now it stood closed, and her keycard access didn't extend to interior doors, meaning if it had somehow locked, she'd need to report it to her supervisor and answer questions about whether she'd touched anything she shouldn't have. Nina tried the handle, relief flooding through her when it turned easily, the door opening to reveal the office exactly as she'd left it, clean and organized and empty except for the map of criminal connections on the wall behind the desk. She pulled the door back to its original slightly ajar position, her paranoia making her wonder if Mr. Moretti had cameras monitoring his space, watching her work through the night, and testing whether she'd noticed small changes he made to check her attention to detail. The elevator doors opened before she could spiral further into anxiety, the mechanism delivering them back to the lobby, level where the night security guard barely glanced up from his phone. Nina clocked out at exactly 5 a.m., her shift complete and her paycheck secured for another week. Sofia walked beside her toward the bus stop, their silence comfortable after 4 hours of careful quiet in someone else's space. The pre-dawn air was cool against Nina's face as they waited for the first bus that would take them across town to their apartment in a building that lacked elevators or doormen or any of the luxury that the people she cleaned took for granted. Sofia leaned against her mother's side, her sketch pad tucked safely in her backpack, the drawings inside representing both artistic talent and potential evidence depending on who saw them and how they chose to interpret what a 7-year-old had observed. Nina found herself thinking about that map on the office wall, the web of connections that represented power she couldn't fully comprehend. She'd spent her entire adult life in spaces adjacent to wealth and influence, cleaning their homes and touching their belongings while remaining functionally invisible to people whose entire world operated by different rules. But this felt different somehow, less like simple economic inequality, and more like proximity to actual danger, the kind that didn't care about invisible cleaning ladies and their observant daughters when eliminating potential problems. The bus arrived, nearly empty at this hour except for other service workers heading home after night shifts in hotels and hospitals and office buildings. Nina guided Sofia to a seat near the back, her daughter immediately pulling out her sketch pad to continue working on something she'd started earlier. Nina watched over her shoulder as the drawing took shape, recognizing the penthouse's living room windows and the city skyline beyond. But Sofia had added something that hadn't been there during their cleaning shift, a figure standing at the window with his back to the viewer, his posture suggesting contemplation, or perhaps loneliness despite the expensive view. The man in Sofia's drawing was clearly Dante Moretti, though the girl had never seen him, her artistic imagination filling in details based on the space's personality, and the single photograph of his younger self with his mother. Nina wanted to tell her to stop, to erase this drawing that somehow felt more invasive than the map she'd started sketching in the office. But Sofia's pencil moved with confidence that came from genuine artistic vision rather than simple documentation, and Nina recognized that her daughter was creating something that transcended evidence or testimony. This was interpretation rather than recording, emotional truth rather than literal fact. The drawing showed a man surrounded by wealth and power but fundamentally alone, the vast penthouse stretching empty behind him while the city glittered indifferently below. Sofia had captured something essential about what it meant to live in that space, the isolation that came from being dangerous enough that nobody dared enter without explicit permission, successful enough that vulnerability became liability instead of human connection. Nina felt unexpected sympathy rising in her chest for Dante Moretti, this man she'd seen exactly once and whose bathroom she'd just scrubbed clean of blood evidence. The drawing revealed what his careful organization and minimal personal touches had already suggested, that all his power and resources couldn't purchase the simple comfort of having people present because they wanted to be rather than because they were paid or intimidated into proximity. Their apartment building appeared outside the bus window, a rundown structure in a neighborhood where police sirens provided the soundtrack to daily life. Nina and Sofia climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their studio unit, the doors deadbolts and chain lock offering minimal security but more psychological comfort than actual protection. Sofia headed immediately for the corner that served as her art space, spreading her drawings across the floor to study them with critical attention to composition and shading. Nina collapsed onto their secondhand couch, exhaustion settling over her like a physical weight now that adrenaline was fading. She'd survived another shift in the penthouse, earned another night's pay, and avoided creating any obvious problems that would cost her this job. But looking at Sofia's drawings spread across their apartment floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed some invisible line tonight, noticed things that were meant to remain unnoticed, and documented observations that could become dangerous if they ever reached the wrong eyes. Sofia looked up from her drawings with that serious expression that made her seem far older than 7, asking quietly if they were going back to the penthouse tomorrow night. Nina explained that the cleaning rotation was weekly, so they'd return in 7 days to repeat the process. Her daughter nodded slowly, already planning what she'd observe next time, what details she'd capture, what truths she'd translate into art despite her mother's fear about making them visible. The sun was rising now, pale light filtering through their apartment's single window to illuminate space that measured maybe 400 square feet compared to the penthouse's 6,000. Nina looked at the contrast between their lives and realized that Sofia's drawings had captured something more profound than simple documentation of someone else's home. Her daughter had somehow seen past the luxury to the human isolation underneath, creating art that revealed wealth couldn't purchase connection, and power didn't prevent loneliness. She wondered if Dante Moretti ever stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows watching the sunrise over a city he controlled through fear and influence, whether he ever wished for the simple comfort of sharing that view with someone who chose to be there rather than someone he'd hired or intimidated into proximity. The thought felt dangerous, humanizing someone who needed to remain threatening in Nina's mind to justify the fear that kept her careful and compliant. Sofia had fallen asleep on the floor surrounded by her drawings, exhaustion finally overcoming her artistic drive. Nina covered her with a blanket and gathered the sketch pad to put it safely away where it wouldn't get damaged. The drawings would probably never be seen by anyone except the 2 of them, filed away with hundreds of other observations Sofia had captured throughout her young life. But as Nina placed the sketch pad on the shelf where they kept Sofia's completed notebooks, she couldn't help wondering what would happen if Dante Moretti ever saw these drawings, particularly the one showing him standing alone at his penthouse windows. Would he recognize the empathy in Sofia's rendering, the way she'd somehow captured his isolation through pure artistic intuition? Or would he see only invasion of privacy, documentation of weakness, evidence that someone had looked too closely at the carefully constructed fortress he maintained around his private life? The question remained unanswered as Nina finally allowed herself to sleep, her alarm set for noon when she'd need to wake up and begin preparing for another night's work, either at the penthouse if her supervisor called with a schedule change, or at one of the other buildings in her rotation. The cycle continued, cleaning up after people whose lives she touched peripherally without ever truly entering, making their spaces pristine while remaining invisible within the structures that separated their worlds. But something had shifted during that first night in Dante Moretti's penthouse. Some invisible boundary crossed when Sofia's artistic eye had seen past the facade to the loneliness underneath. Nina couldn't articulate exactly what had changed, only that she felt it like a weight settling into place, the sense that their lives had become entangled with forces they didn't fully understand and couldn't control. The week ahead would reveal whether that entanglement led toward danger or something else entirely, whether Sofia's drawings would remain safely hidden or somehow find their way into hands that might interpret them as threat or revelation or possibly both. For now, they slept in their small apartment while across the city, in a penthouse nobody dared enter, A powerful man returned to spaces that sparkled with professional cleanliness but remained fundamentally empty of human warmth. The call came 3 days later, Nina's supervisor's voice carrying unusual tension as she explained that Mr. Moretti had requested an immediate schedule change. Nina would now be cleaning the penthouse every other night instead of weekly, effective immediately, with a 30% pay increase that came without negotiation or explanation. The supervisor's tone suggested this wasn't good news despite the additional money, her careful phrasing indicating that being specifically requested by someone like Dante Moretti meant you'd either impressed him or concerned him, and both possibilities carried risks. Nina stood in their apartment holding her phone, watching Sofia draw at her makeshift art table while processing what the schedule change actually meant. More money would solve immediate problems, the electric bill that had been threatening disconnection, the dentist appointment she'd been postponing for 6 months, maybe even proper art supplies for Sofia instead of the cheap notebooks and pencils they could barely afford. But increased access to Dante Moretti's private space also meant increased opportunities to notice things she shouldn't, to make mistakes that could cost more than money could fix. Sofia looked up from her drawing, her observant eyes reading her mother's expression with the accuracy that came from years of having only each other to rely on. She asked quietly if they were going back to the penthouse tonight, her voice carrying curiosity rather than fear, already planning what she might see during this next visit. Nina wanted to tell her no, wanted to refuse the schedule change, and maintain the relative safety of minimal contact with people whose power made them fundamentally dangerous regardless of their intentions. But 30% more income meant survival versus slow drowning in bills and debt, meant being able to keep Sofia fed and clothed, and housed without the constant terror of one unexpected expense destroying everything they'd managed to maintain. Nina called her supervisor back and accepted the new schedule, her voice steadier than her hands as she confirmed she'd be at the tower by 11 p.m. for the first of her new rotation shifts. That evening, as they prepared to leave for work, Sofia packed her sketch pad with unusual care, adding extra pencils and a small pencil sharpener Nina didn't remember buying. The girl's expression showed determination that felt both appropriate for someone developing their artistic skills and concerning for a 7-year-old who should be more interested in toys and games than documenting the private spaces of dangerous men. Nina reminded herself that Sofia's art had always been her way of processing the world, that drawing gave her control over circumstances that otherwise would overwhelm a child dealing with poverty and instability. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt different this time, familiarity replacing novelty, but not reducing the underlying tension that came from entering spaces where violence and power concentrated behind elegant facades. Nina's keycard worked as before, the biometric scan accepting her thumbprint and the heavy door opening to reveal the penthouse exactly as she'd left it 3 nights ago. The motion sensor lights activated in sequence, and Nina wondered if Dante Moretti ever came home to darkness, if he ever experienced the simple human comfort of lights already on because someone was there waiting. Sofia entered with less hesitation than their first visit, already moving toward the living room windows that offered the city view she'd sketched from memory. Nina started her cleaning routine in the kitchen, noting that the refrigerator now contained actual food instead of just takeout containers and bottled water. Someone had stocked it with ingredients that suggested meal preparation, fresh vegetables, and quality proteins arranged with the same geometric precision as everything else in the penthouse, though the pristine condition suggested they remained unused despite their presence. The office door stood slightly ajar again, and Nina approached with the caution of someone who'd learned that patterns meant something in spaces organized with such deliberate intention. She pushed it open and immediately froze, her breath catching as she registered that the room wasn't empty. Dante Moretti sat at his desk, his attention focused on the leather portfolio open before him, his posture suggesting he'd been there for hours despite the late hour that should have had him elsewhere conducting whatever business kept him occupied through the nights. He looked up as Nina stood paralyzed in the doorway, his dark eyes meeting hers with that same focused attention she remembered from their brief previous encounter. His expression remained neutral, giving no indication whether her presence was expected or intrusive, wanted or merely tolerated as necessity. Nina's mind raced through possibilities, wondering if she should apologize and retreat, ask if he wanted her to come back later, or simply proceed with her work as though finding him here was normal rather than the complete disruption of a careful separation that made her job tolerable. Dante spoke first, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't require volume to command attention. He explained without preamble that he'd be working through the night and she should clean around him, maintaining her normal routine without concern for his presence. His tone suggested this was simple fact rather than request or permission, establishing immediately that the penthouse remained his domain regardless of her assigned cleaning responsibilities. Nina nodded, her voice catching slightly as she confirmed she understood, already calculating how to work efficiently while maintaining the careful distance that kept people like her safe around people like him. She retreated to continue cleaning other areas, her movements less certain now that she knew he was present, watching or potentially watching even when his attention appeared focused elsewhere. Sofia had positioned herself near the living room windows with her sketch pad, her usual observation spot apparently compelling enough that even awareness of Dante's presence didn't deter her routine. Nina wanted to call her away, keep her daughter close and under direct supervision, but drawing attention to Sofia by treating her as something unusual felt more dangerous than allowing her to continue her quiet documentation. An hour passed with Nina, working methodically through the living areas, her professional competence overriding her nervousness enough that she completed her tasks with the thoroughness her supervisor expected. She was dusting the library shelves when Dante appeared in the doorway, his presence announced by the slight sound of his footsteps despite the expensive shoes that should have made him nearly silent on the hardwood floors. Nina turned, her hand automatically tightening on the cleaning cloth she held like it offered some protection against whatever this interaction might require. Dante's attention wasn't on Nina, but on Sofia, his gaze tracking the girl's focused concentration as her pencil moved across paper with quick, confident strokes. He moved closer to where Sofia sat, his approach careful enough that she looked up from her drawing with curiosity rather than fear, her child's instinct apparently not registering him as immediate threat despite every rational reason she should have been terrified. Nina's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched this interaction, her body moving automatically to position herself between her daughter and this man whose power made him fundamentally unpredictable. Dante stopped several feet away from Sofia, maintaining distance that suggested he understood his presence might be intimidating even if the girl showed no obvious fear. He asked quietly what she was drawing, his tone surprisingly gentle for someone whose reputation was built on violence and intimidation. Sofia held up her sketch pad without hesitation, showing him the cityscape she'd been rendering with careful attention to the way lights reflected off building windows and the patterns they created against the night sky. The drawing was remarkable even to Nina's untrained eye, the composition balanced and the details precise in ways that revealed Sofia's unusual talent. Dante studied it with attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite courtesy, his expression shifting into something that might have been appreciation or possibly recognition of capability that transcended what should be possible for a 7-year-old working with cheap pencils and drugstore paper. He asked if Sofia drew often, and the girl nodded, explaining in her quiet voice that she liked to remember things by putting them on paper. That drawing helped her understand what she saw. Nina watched this exchange with growing unease, understanding that Sofia's talent was revealing itself to exactly the kind of person who might interpret it as useful rather than simply impressive. Artists who could capture details with photographic accuracy had value in worlds where documentation mattered and official records could be problematic. She wanted to interrupt, redirect the conversation, establish boundaries that would keep her daughter safely categorized as just a cleaning lady's kid rather than someone with skills that might be exploited. But Dante's next question went in an unexpected direction, asking Sofia if she'd ever had professional art instruction or if her ability was entirely self-taught through observation and practice. The girl explained that her school had an art teacher who taught her some techniques, but mostly she learned by trying to make her drawings look like what she actually saw rather than what she thought things should look like. Her explanation carried the kind of insight that suggested she understood artistic philosophy beyond simple mechanical skill, that she developed her talent through genuine passion rather than just technical practice. Dante turned his attention to Nina, his dark eyes assessing her with the same focused intensity he'd given Sofia's artwork. He stated, rather than asked, that she must be proud of her daughter's capability, and Nina confirmed this was true, her voice steadier than she felt as she added that Sofia had always been observant and talented with any art supplies they could provide. The conversation felt dangerous in ways Nina couldn't fully articulate, this powerful man showing interest in her daughter's abilities while they stood in his private space, where blood evidence had recently required cleaning. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Dante asked how old Sofia was, and when Nina answered 7, his expression shifted into something that might have been surprise or calculation or both. He observed that 7 seemed young for the level of technical skill and compositional understanding the drawing displayed, his tone suggesting professional assessment rather than simple compliment. Nina felt protective instinct rising, her body language shifting to place herself more obviously between her daughter and this man whose interest felt increasingly like evaluation rather than casual curiosity. But Sofia, with the kind of innocent directness that children possess before learning to fear consequences, asked Dante if he was the person who lived in this penthouse. Her question carried genuine curiosity rather than fear, simply wanting to confirm her assumption about whose space she'd been observing and documenting through her art. Dante confirmed this was his home, and Sofia nodded as though this explained something, her expression suggesting she'd been assembling details about him through environmental observation the same way she learned about everyone and everything she drew. The girl flipped through her sketch pad to a drawing Nina had hoped would remain private, the one showing a solitary figure standing at the penthouse windows, looking out over the city with posture that suggested loneliness despite the expensive view. Sofia held it up for Dante to see, explaining that she'd drawn him even though she hadn't met him yet, using the space and the photograph in his bedroom to understand what kind of person he might be. The innocent revelation carried weight that made Nina's breath catch, her daughter having just admitted to observing private details and making interpretations that could be seen as invasive or insightful depending on how Dante chose to react. Dante took the sketch pad from Sofia's hands, his movement careful as he studied the drawing with attention that stretched seconds into what felt like hours. His expression remained neutral, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested the image had landed with emotional impact he hadn't expected. Nina prepared herself for anger or accusation, for the consequences of her daughter having seen too much and revealed it too honestly through artistic interpretation that transcended simple documentation. But when Dante spoke, his voice carried something that sounded almost like wonder beneath the control, asking how Sofia had known to draw him looking out the window when she'd never seen him do that. The girl explained with characteristic directness that the windows were positioned to see the whole city, and someone powerful enough to own this space would probably want to look at what they controlled, but the penthouse was too empty and quiet for someone who was happy, so probably he stood there sometimes feeling lonely even with a nice view. The psychological insight coming from a 7-year-old should have been impossible or at least improbable, but Sofia delivered it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating observable fact rather than making dramatic interpretation. Nina watched Dante's face carefully, trying to read whether this revelation would anger him or whether Sofia's innocent honesty might somehow bypass the defenses that usually prevented anyone from seeing past his carefully constructed facade of power and control. Dante handed the sketch pad back to Sofia, his movement deliberate, as though he was consciously choosing how to respond to this unexpected vulnerability. He told the girl that her drawing was remarkably accurate, that he did sometimes stand at those windows feeling exactly what she captured through pencil and paper. His admission felt like confession, or perhaps recognition that someone had finally seen past the performance to the isolation underneath, that a child's artistic intuition had accomplished what adults protected by fear and self-preservation would never attempt. Sofia accepted this confirmation with a simple nod, turning to a fresh page in her sketch pad, as though the profound moment had been just another data point in her ongoing observation of the world. Dante watched her for another moment before returning his attention to Nina, his expression shifting back into something more neutral and controlled. He asked if Nina would be willing to bring Sofia to the penthouse during her cleaning shifts rather than leaving her in whatever after-hours care situation she currently used, his phrasing making it clear this was request rather than demand despite the power differential that made refusal complicated. Nina's mind raced through implications. understanding that bringing Sofia here regularly would mean more exposure to Dante and his world, more opportunities for her daughter's observant nature to document things that shouldn't be seen or remembered. But it would also eliminate the constant worry about childcare, the juggling of schedules, and the guilt of leaving Sofia in situations that weren't ideal because better options didn't exist for single mothers working night shifts. The practical benefits, weighed with protective instinct, and Nina found herself agreeing before she'd fully processed all the potential consequences. Dante nodded once, accepting her agreement as though the outcome had been predetermined, then added that Sofia was welcome to draw whatever interested her during these visits, his permission both generous and potentially dangerous depending on what her artistic documentation might eventually capture. He explained that the penthouse contained many interesting things for an observant artist, his tone suggesting he understood exactly what kind of details Sofia might notice and translate into art that revealed more than simple visual recording. The rest of that night's cleaning passed with Dante working in his office, while Nina completed her routine with hyper-awareness of his presence. Sofia continued drawing near the windows, her concentration absolute as she filled pages with architectural details and city views that seemed safe enough even as Nina worried about what other observations she might be storing away for later artistic rendering. When they finally left at 5 a.m., Nina felt exhausted in ways that went beyond physical labor, the emotional weight of navigating this new dynamic with Dante having drained reserves she didn't know she'd been using. The pattern established that night continued over the following weeks, Nina cleaning the penthouse every other evening while Sofia drew quietly in various locations throughout the space. Dante's presence became more frequent than absent, his work apparently requiring late night hours in his private office, even when he could have conducted business from any of the Moretti Holdings corporate locations. Nina tried not to think too hard about why he'd suddenly shifted his schedule to coincide with her cleaning rotation, whether it was surveillance or something else entirely that kept him present during her work. Sofia's sketch pads, filled with drawings that captured the penthouse from every angle, architectural details rendered with precision that would have impressed professional artists. But she also drew Dante when he wasn't looking, quick sketches that caught him in moments of unguarded expression, his face showing exhaustion or frustration, or occasionally something that might have been loneliness breaking through his careful control. Nina discovered these portraits when reviewing Sofia's work, her heart clenching at the empathy her daughter brought to rendering a man most people would only see as dangerous. The breakthrough came during their third week in this new routine, Nina working in the library while Sofia sketched nearby, and Dante sat in the adjacent living area reviewing documents. A sound from the hallway made Dante move with sudden intensity, his hand automatically going to his waistband where Nina knew without looking he kept a weapon. The moment passed when his phone buzzed with a message that apparently explained the sound, his posture relaxing incrementally, though tension remained in his shoulders. Sofia had looked up from her drawing at the sound, her observant eyes tracking Dante's reaction with the same careful attention she gave everything. When he'd settled back into reviewing his documents, she returned to her sketch pad, but Nina saw what she was capturing now, Dante in that moment of absolute readiness for violence, his body language revealing the constant vigilance that came with living in a world where threats could materialize without warning. The drawing would be remarkable in its accuracy and terrifying in what it revealed about the reality beneath his controlled facade. Nina moved closer to Sofia, intending to suggest she focus on safer subjects like the city views or architectural details that couldn't accidentally document dangerous truths. But Dante spoke before she could redirect her daughter's attention, his voice carrying across the space with quiet observation that Sofia had captured something essential about what his life actually required. He didn't sound angry or threatened, just perhaps resigned that someone had finally seen and documented what he usually kept carefully hidden. He stood and crossed to where Sofia sat, settling into a chair near her with movement that suggested he was consciously making himself less intimidating through casual posture rather than looming presence. He asked if he could see what she'd drawn, and Sofia handed over her sketch pad without hesitation, her trust apparently complete despite every rational reason she should have been cautious around someone whose reputation was built on being dangerous. Dante studied the drawing of himself in that moment of readiness for violence, his expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind his careful control. Nina held her breath, waiting for anger or accusation, for consequences that would teach them both the cost of seeing too much and documenting it too honestly. But when Dante spoke, his voice carried something that sounded almost like relief, stating that Sofia had given him something nobody else ever had, honest reflection of what his life actually looked like rather than the performance everyone else saw because they were too frightened or too careful to acknowledge the reality. He asked Sofia if she understood what made him react that way to unexpected sounds, whether her observation extended beyond visual documentation into comprehension of the psychological reality behind what she captured. The girl considered this question with the seriousness she brought to everything, finally explaining that people who had to protect themselves all the time got tired but couldn't stop being alert because the danger was real even when it wasn't happening right that moment. Her analysis demonstrated understanding far beyond what 7 years should provide, and Nina recognized that her daughter's artistic observation had developed into genuine empathy, the ability to see not just what people looked like, but what their expressions and postures revealed about internal experience. Sofia had somehow intuited that Dante's power came at the cost of constant vigilance, that his control required never fully relaxing even in supposedly safe spaces. Dante handed the sketch pad back to Sofia, but his attention remained on her with intensity that suggested calculation rather than simple interest. He asked if she'd ever drawn other people this way, capturing them in moments that revealed truth rather than performance. Sofia nodded, explaining that her drawings usually showed what people were feeling underneath what they wanted others to see, that the interesting part wasn't faces but the emotions that came through and how people held themselves when they thought nobody was paying attention. Nina watched this exchange with growing understanding that her daughter's talent had just revealed itself as something potentially valuable to someone whose business required reading people accurately and quickly. Artists who could capture psychological truth through observation might have applications in Dante's world, ways of documenting information that couldn't be recorded through photographs or official surveillance. The thought terrified her even as practical necessity made her wonder if this capability might become their ticket to better circumstances, if handled carefully. But Dante's next statement went in an unexpected direction, asking Sofia if she'd like proper art instruction from professionals who could develop her natural talent into something extraordinary. He explained that the city had programs for gifted young artists, intensive courses taught by working professionals that could accelerate her development significantly. The offer came without obvious strings attached, just recognition that capability deserved opportunity, regardless of economic circumstances that made private instruction impossible for families like Nina's. Sofia's eyes lit up with interest. She usually kept carefully controlled, her desire for better art education one of the few things that penetrated her characteristic reserve. Nina felt torn between gratitude for this potentially life-changing opportunity and suspicion about what obligations might come attached despite Dante's seemingly straightforward offer. People like him didn't give things away without expecting something in return, even when the return wasn't immediately specified or demanded. Dante seemed to read Nina's hesitation, his attention shifting from Sofia to her mother with that focused intensity that missed nothing. He stated clearly that this was offer without obligation, simply recognition that talent like Sofia's deserved development, and he had resources to facilitate that development. His tone carried sincerity that felt genuine, though Nina's experience with powerful men suggested sincerity, and manipulation could coexist without contradiction when someone wanted something badly enough to be patient in pursuing it. The conversation shifted when Dante's phone rang, the ringtone different from his usual calls, carrying urgency that made his expression shift into something harder and more focused. He answered with single-word responses, his body language communicating readiness for action, even while he remained seated. When he ended the call, his attention returned briefly to Nina and Sofia, stating that he needed to leave immediately, but they should continue their usual routine, lock up when finished, and he'd see them during the next scheduled shift. He was gone within minutes, moving with purpose that suggested the call had been about business that couldn't wait or be delegated. Nina and Sofia were left alone in the vast penthouse, the sudden absence of his presence making the space feel even larger and emptier than usual. Sofia returned to her drawing while Nina continued cleaning, both of them processing the evening's unexpected turn towards something that felt like connection rather than simply transaction between employer and employee. The weeks that followed established new patterns, Dante's presence during Nina's shifts becoming expected rather than surprising. He and Sofia developed an unlikely rapport, his interest in her artwork genuine enough that he'd spend time discussing technique and composition with seriousness that suggested he valued her artistic perspective. Beyond its potential utility, Nina watched these interactions with complicated feelings, grateful that someone recognized her daughter's talent while worried about what investment in that talent might eventually require as repayment. Sofia's art instruction began the following month, Dante having arranged enrollment in a prestigious program normally reserved for students whose families could afford tuition that exceeded Nina's monthly income. The instructors recognized Sofia's unusual capability immediately, her observational skills and technical control marking her as genuinely gifted rather than simply well-trained. She flourished in this environment, her artwork developing new sophistication while maintaining the emotional insight that had always characterized her best pieces. Nina's financial situation improved dramatically during this period. The increased pay from her modified schedule combined with reduced expenses from having Sofia's art instruction covered, making it possible to catch up on bills and even start saving small amounts. She moved them to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, the upgrade modest by most standards but transformative compared to their previous situation. Sofia's own bedroom meant the girl finally had dedicated art space, walls she could cover with drawings without worrying about damaged deposits or landlord complaints. But the most significant change came in the relationship developing between Nina and Dante, their initial wariness transforming gradually into something neither seemed to have intended but both found difficult to resist. His presence during her cleaning shifts became less about surveillance or evaluation and more about simply being in proximity to people who saw him as human rather than just dangerous or powerful. They began talking during her work, conversations that started as small talk but evolved into genuine exchange of perspectives and experiences. Nina found herself telling him about Sofia's early childhood, the circumstances that had led to single motherhood, and the struggles of raising a gifted child while working multiple jobs to keep them housed and fed. Dante listened with attention that felt genuine, asking questions that revealed interest rather than polite courtesy. In return, he shared carefully edited versions of his own history, the trajectory from regular kid in that photograph with his mother to the man who now controlled significant criminal infrastructure while maintaining legitimate business facades. The vulnerability between them built incrementally, neither willing to rush toward connection that felt both inevitable and potentially catastrophic, given the power differential and practical complications of their respective circumstances. Nina understood that getting involved with someone like Dante meant accepting parts of his life she'd prefer to remain ignorant about, violence and illegality that existed whether she acknowledged it or not. But she also saw the isolation beneath his power, the fundamental loneliness Sofia had captured in that first drawing, and found herself wanting to offer something beyond just professional cleaning service. The shift happened during Nina's 4th month in the new cleaning schedule, Dante arriving at the penthouse while she was working with visible tension that suggested the night's business had gone badly. He moved immediately to the windows where Sofia had first drawn him standing alone, his posture screaming frustrated rage held barely in check. Nina watched from the kitchen where she'd been cleaning, uncertain whether to give him privacy or offer some acknowledgement of his obvious distress. Sofia made the decision for both of them, approaching Dante with her sketch pad as though his dangerous mood didn't register as threat to her 7-year-old assessment. She stood beside him at the window, not speaking or touching, just present in that quiet way she had of offering comfort through simple companionship. Dante looked down at her with expression that transformed from rage to something softer, his body language shifting as her presence apparently penetrated whatever mental space he'd been occupying. He asked what she was drawing, and Sofia showed him a new sketch of the city view, this one including the reflection of his face in the window glass, capturing both the external world and his internal state through the transparent overlay. The technical skill required to render this double image with cheap pencils on drugstore paper was remarkable, but more impressive was the emotional intelligence that had led her to capture both what Dante was looking at and what his expression revealed about how he was experiencing that view. Dante studied the drawing for a long moment before speaking, his voice rough when he finally told Sofia that she had gift for seeing truth that most people spent their whole lives avoiding. His statement carried weight beyond simple compliment, acknowledgement that her artistic capability had become something he valued separate from its potential utility. Sofia accepted this recognition with her usual serious nod, then did something completely unexpected, reaching up to take Dante's hand and leading him away from the window toward the couch where her other drawings were spread out. Nina watched this interaction with heart in her throat, her daughter treating this dangerous man with casual trust that should have been impossible given everything Nina had taught her about caution around people whose power made them unpredictable. But Dante allowed himself to be led, settling onto the couch while Sofia showed him the series of drawings she'd been working on, a progression that captured the penthouse at different times of night with varying light and shadow creating different emotional tones. The artwork demonstrated Sofia's growing sophistication, her technical skills developing rapidly under professional instruction, while her innate empathy remained the foundation of her artistic vision. Dante studied each drawing with genuine attention, asking questions about her choices and process, treating her as serious artist rather than just talented child. Their conversation revealed mutual respect that transcended age and circumstance, artist and observer connecting through shared understanding that visual documentation could capture truth that words often missed. Nina finished her cleaning while Dante and Sofia discussed art, their voices creating backdrop that felt unexpectedly domestic in the space that usually echoed with emptiness. When it was time to leave, Dante walked them to the elevator, his presence no longer intimidating but simply familiar, someone who'd become part of their routine rather than threat to be carefully navigated. He thanked Nina for her work, then turned to Sofia and told her he looked forward to seeing her next drawings, his tone suggesting this was genuine interest rather than polite courtesy. The elevator doors closed on his face, and Nina realized with sudden clarity that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship with Dante Moretti. They were no longer simply cleaning lady, an employer maintaining professional distance, but something more complicated and potentially dangerous, three people finding unexpected connection in spaces where loneliness and observation intersected in ways none of them had intended, but all of them apparently needed. The crisis arrived 6 months into their routine, Dante's phone exploding with calls during one of Nina's shifts, his face transforming into something hard and lethal as he listened to reports that someone had breached his security network. Rival organization had access to systems, stolen information about his operations, and worse, obtained details about people connected to him personally. His eyes found Nina and Sofia with expression that combined apology and desperate calculation, understanding dawning that his world's violence was about to crash into theirs whether any of them wanted it or not. Dante made 3 calls in rapid succession, his voice carrying absolute authority as he arranged immediate protection for Nina and Sofia, safe house relocation until the threat could be neutralized. Nina's protest died as she saw genuine fear beneath his control, recognition that he wouldn't be overreacting without cause. Sofia gathered her sketch pads with calm efficiency that suggested she'd somehow prepared for this moment, her observant nature having apparently cataloged the dangers that came with proximity to someone whose power attracted enemies willing to target vulnerabilities. The safe house was another penthouse across the city, smaller than Dante's but equally secure, staffed with guards whose competence was evident in their silent watchfulness. Nina and Sofia settled into this temporary refuge, while Dante disappeared to handle whatever retaliation his compromised security required. The first night stretched endlessly, Nina unable to sleep while Sofia drew their new surroundings with mechanical precision that suggested displacement rather than genuine interest in documenting the space. 3 days passed before Dante returned, his appearance revealing the cost of whatever he'd done to eliminate the threat. Exhaustion, and something darker lived in his expression, confirmation that protecting them had required the kind of violence Nina had always known existed beneath his careful control but had never directly witnessed evidence of. He sat heavily on the safe house couch, and Sofia immediately moved to his side with her sketch pad, showing him drawings she'd made during their isolation. The artwork depicted memories rather than observations, Sofia having drawn scenes from the penthouse that had become their unlikely meeting ground, architectural details rendered with affection that revealed the space had become meaningful beyond its physical luxury. One drawing showed Dante, Nina, and Sofia together near the living room windows, composition suggesting family rather than employer and employees, emotional truth that Sofia's artistic intuition had recognized before the adults acknowledged it consciously. Dante studied this drawing for a long moment before speaking, his voice rough when he told them the threat had been permanently eliminated, but the breach had revealed how exposed his personal connections made him vulnerable. His enemies now knew that Nina and Sofia mattered to him beyond simple professional relationship, making them targets for anyone wanting leverage against his operations. The practical solution would be distance, severing the connection that had developed accidentally but undeniably between three people who shouldn't have fit together but somehow did. Nina felt something crack in her chest at this logical conclusion, understanding that safety required separation, even as every instinct screamed against walking away from what they'd found in that penthouse during stolen conversations and quiet moments of unexpected domesticity. But before she could voice acceptance of this necessary ending, Sofia did something that changed everything, handing Dante another drawing, this one showing him standing at his windows exactly as she captured that first night. Except in this version he wasn't alone. Two figures stood beside him sharing the view. The drawing was confession and plea simultaneously, Sofia's artistic documentation revealing what she wanted rather than simply what she'd observed. Dante's hand trembled slightly as he held the sketch, his careful control cracking enough that Nina saw the loneliness beneath his power, the desperate desire for connection that his circumstances made impossibly dangerous. He looked at Nina with expression that asked permission, or perhaps offered warning, making clear that choosing proximity meant accepting risks that came with his world. Nina made her decision in the space between heartbeats, crossing to where Dante sat and taking his hand with deliberateness that answered every question he hadn't spoken aloud. She told him they'd survived poverty and instability, and a dozen other threats that came with being vulnerable in a city that didn't care about people without resources or protection. If they could survive that, they could survive whatever his enemies might attempt, especially with his resources backing them instead of facing dangers alone. Sofia leaned against Dante's other side, her small presence completing something that had been fractured in all of them before they'd found each other in that penthouse nobody else dared enter. Dante's arms came around them both with careful gentleness that contradicted his capacity for violence, his embrace promising protection, even as it acknowledged the vulnerability that connection created. They stayed like that for a long moment, three people who shouldn't have fit together but had somehow become family through observation and empathy and the kind of loneliness that recognized itself across vast differences in circumstance and power. The months that followed required adjustment, Nina and Sofia moving officially into the penthouse under security protocols that made their protection absolute priority. Sofia's art flourished in this environment, her talent developing under professional instruction, while her emotional insight remained the foundation of increasingly sophisticated work. She began a series depicting transformation, drawings that showed lonely spaces becoming homes through presence of people who chose to be there rather than obligation or fear. Nina found herself building life she'd never imagined possible, financial security allowing her to pursue education she'd abandoned years ago, while Sofia's future expanded beyond survival into genuine possibility. But more significant than material improvement was the emotional transformation, all three of them learning that family could form in unexpected configurations through observation that became empathy that became love. Dante remained dangerous, his business requiring capacities for violence and control that Nina couldn't entirely separate from the man who read bedtime stories to Sofia and discussed art theory with genuine interest. But she'd learned that people contained multitudes, that protection and violence could coexist in someone who'd built fortress around himself before a 7-year-old's drawings revealed the loneliness underneath. Sofia's artistic documentation had given them all something they'd been missing, reflection of truth that made connection possible across boundaries that should have been insurmountable. The penthouse that nobody had dared enter became home, its vast spaces filled finally with laughter and conversation, and the sound of pencils scratching across paper as Sofia captured their life together through art that revealed emotional truth beneath surface reality. Her drawings lined the walls now, permanent documentation of how observation could transform isolation into belonging, how a cleaning lady's daughter had somehow seen past power and danger to the human need underneath, creating family through empathy rendered in charcoal and pencil on cheap paper that had become priceless. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.